Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to our Presbytery of Baltimore podcast. It's good to be with you all virtually on Zoom through this podcast. Today, I am so delighted to have my friend, a fellow pastor in our presbytery, Pastor Tim Hughes-Williams. Tim, welcome. Thank you for being here. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us. Friends, for those who haven't had the pleasure of meeting Tim yet, he's a wonderful person. And aside from that, he's also the current pastor at Light Street Presbyterian Church in the Federal Hill neighborhood of Baltimore. Tim's been there for about 4 years now, just
Yep.
completed 4 years, which is amazing. And Tim also is a dual Masters of Divinity and Social Work person. You've got your education in Divinity and Social Work, which has allowed you to do kind of urban ministry. And Tim, you were telling me that most of your ministry has been in an urban setting.
Really all of it. All my churches, 3 churches,
Yeah.
all in urban environments.
And let's start there. Let's talk about that. Tell me what drew you to urban ministry? Was it just kind of happenstance, providence, as we might say as well? What drew you to it?
I grew up in the suburbs, so I was not an urban kid at all. And then I went to a small town college, but then I did a 1-year kind of urban ministry immersion in West Philadelphia after college, where I did an AmeriCorps project at a local high school, and then I was working with a church in West Philly. And I just kind of considered it the second half of my college education, all crammed into 1 year. And
That's
just sort of,
cool.
I think I'm a city person, and who didn't grow up in the city. Is that possible?
Yeah, absolutely.
So like before it was any kind of like mission, it was just me like loving the city. But then I did want to go into a seminary program that offered a dual social work program because I specifically wanted to engage on that level. But also, of course, it was illegal for me to be ordained in the PCUSA at the time that I went to seminary. So I needed a bivocational path.
Absolutely. And so, and actually, I'm glad you mentioned your dual social work, because Melissa and I have thought about that. Man, if I could go back, I would have done that. That would have been a great fit for me as well. Because similarly, I think I have an interest in urban ministry and different cultures, diversity, and so on and so forth.
Sure.
So, well, that's wonderful. And so you tell me more about you, about your background. Tell me your story. I know that's a big question to ask, but where'd you grow up? Where'd you go to school? All
I was
that kind
born
of
in
stuff.
Baltimore, which is fun because I didn't live here for the most part. My mom was in her last semester at Hopkins when I was born at Union Memorial Hospital. So I claim Baltimore, even though we moved to North Carolina before I was 1 year old. And so I really grew up in North Carolina.
Oh wow! Yeah.
My dad and grandfather were Southern Baptist preachers.
I see.
So I was like deeply embedded in the Southern Baptist Church. Went to the little kids camp associated with the Southern Baptist Convention.
Yes.
Didn't know any Presbyterians, didn't care to know any Presbyterians.
I get
and then
it.
I went to Davidson, which is a Presbyterian college, and that was the first step on my slippery slope towards Reformed theology.
What did you study at Davidson? If you don't
English.
mind me asking?
Yeah, English.
Right.
I love stories, and it has served me well. For a while, I did go through that period of time of wondering what I was going to do with that degree.
Absolutely.
But it served me really well. So I majored in English, minored in religious studies.
Oh wow!
And then I did have no idea what I was doing when I graduated. So that's why I went into that 1 year in West Philadelphia.
Gotcha.
And
What got you connected there? Teaching assistant?
I was a teaching assistant in that high school. So I was
I see.
exploring both professions. I was exploring how it felt to be an English teacher. But then I was also living in an intentional Christian community and worshiping at this church. And I guess, my biggest takeaway, Philadelphia has changed a lot since 2003. But back then, especially West Philly, like it was just kind of there weren't a whole lot of functional institutions in the neighborhood. So like the public schools, the government agencies, and the churches were like the functioning institutions in that community. And so I had this like really stark picture of what it might look like to be involved with an institution in a city like that. And that's why the dual degree was so appealing, because I saw the church doing really amazing things. And this was a church that I did not relate to particularly. I mean, it was a Black Baptist church. It was an amazing congregation. It was not my tradition, but they were just really saving people's lives, literally, and pulling people out of various lifestyles and economies. And so I got really inspired by that. And I also wanted to look at the systems, and to be honest with you, I was like kind of mad that I was 23 years old and didn't know anything about so much of this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
So anyway, that's why I went to seminary.
Wow.
But also, I guess that's not entirely why. I came out of the closet that year. So in the same time that I was sort of like worshiping in this Black church and working in this high school, Will Smith's high school, I like to say.
No way.
In West Philadelphia. Yes, his actual high school.
Well, the Will Smith jokes were running through my head, but I didn't want to. I mean,
I was there. I was literally there.
Oh, that's amazing.
But that's when I came out, and so going to seminary was about putting all the pieces back together after pretty explosive year.
Sure. And what seminary did you end up going to?
It was the dual program with Princeton Theological Seminary and the Rutgers School of Social Work. And you can just take the train 30 minutes back and forth between New Brunswick and Princeton.
Oh, that's awesome.
So, but if you'd asked me then, I would have told you that I was going to be a social worker. I did not think it was likely that I was going to become a minister. And I also was not a Presbyterian when I was in seminary. I was kind of a free agent Christian.
So what was that like coming into the Presbyterian Church, especially with your context of coming out of the closet and kind of this that particular context? What was that like? Was it difficult? Was it freeing? Help me understand.
It was freeing in the sense that I didn't feel a responsibility to any tradition. So I felt a responsibility to my faith, but I did not feel denominationally attached.
Sure.
And to be honest with you, I saw no compelling reason to become a Presbyterian at that time. The Presbyterian Church was tied up in knots over the issue of gay ordination, and gay marriage was kind of not even a conversation yet. So I thought I was probably going to become a UCC pastor. But then, so I did 3 social work internships and then 1 church internship. And I did that church internship at a little Presbyterian church in South Boston. Oh, wow. And just fell in love with that congregation. It was just the most beautiful little church. And to the degree that I went back and worked there for 3 more summers.
Oh my
while
goodness.
I was finishing my master's program, just not for credit, just to work there. And then when I graduated from the 2 programs, I just moved to Boston and kind of haunted them until they hired me.
That's a good way to do it. Yeah.
I became a Presbyterian church member in 2008, 2 years after I graduated from seminary.
Oh, wow.
And then I entered the ordination process in that same year. So I finally joined a Presbyterian church, and then about a month later, I entered the ordination process.
That's a good way to.
I had the pedigree by accident, which is very, I don't know. The Reformed theologians would say maybe it wasn't an accident, but I had like pretty much perfect Presbyterian resume. So
that's
it worked out.
So once you join this church, you work for them post seminary. What came after that?
I was there for 5.5 years.
5.5. Wow.
So I was the director of youth and children's ministry there in a non-ordained capacity.
Gotcha.
For 5 years.
Okay.
And those years were hard because I loved that church and I was happy to be there, but I was kind of going into debt and
Oh yeah.
feeling a
Oh
little
yeah.
foolish for waiting around for the denomination to make up
Gotcha.
its mind. And it got to the point where I was like, well, if the rules are going to change and I am going to get ordained, then I don't know why I would leave this Presbyterian job, but also how
Yeah.
many more years am I going to do this? I did primarily, it was a grant funded position. So I was outside the operating budget of the church, but I taught music and art classes in this big public housing development that was right next to the church. And then I did a drop-in center for teenagers on Friday nights. So I was pushing this shopping cart that was probably stolen. I don't know where it came from. I found it in the church basement, but it did say Stop and Shop on it. So I was pushing this shopping cart with arts and crafts supplies through the projects and kind of wondering, what the rest of my life was going to look like.
Yeah. Well, and when you said, director of youth and family ministries, I think I was wondering if you were using your social work background in any context, because which was amazing, because I come at it from a different perspective. I kind of didn't use, I went into a different kind of background, but I think that I went into a different setting than what I was thinking of using kind of my background and whatnot. And so that's what I was going to ask if, and it seems like you were able to use some of your background in social work and kind of talking about, that advocacy for urban ministry. And so you were able to use that. You went around pushing a shopping cart full of art supplies around the neighborhood. That's amazing. Yes. Can you tell me about that?
Well, I mean, I got to know the neighborhood so intimately because we basically did provide classes at the church, but we also provided classes in the community center in the public housing development. And so amazing. Especially out there, and doing it for 4 years, I got to know a lot of the families in the neighborhood, and so by the time I left, I felt like I knew the community in a way that I have not replicated since then.
That's amazing. Where did that idea come from? Was it your idea? Was it something the church was already doing?
It was an existing program.
Okay.
Cool. So there were classes every day after school from basically 3:30 to 7.
Oh my goodness.
Some of which were in the building and some of which were in the neighborhood.
That's amazing. Do you have any stories like of your time doing that? Anybody any fun stories that stick with you working with the shopping cart? I'm kind of fixated by this.
Oh man, so many stories.
Amazing.
Well, the shopping cart, I can tell you a story about the shopping cart because a lot of the kids did come to church and they came to church unattended. So they just would walk there, and so it was kind of mayhem during worship.
I could totally see that. Absolutely.
So the degree that we had to start partnering, like we had to start assigning kids to families.
Oh my goodness!
Because otherwise, they were out of hand. But like I did these performative children's sermons, which were kind of like acting out Bible stories. And for David and Goliath, we had a child in the narthex standing in the Stop and Shop shopping cart, and then they were wearing a robe that went all the way to the floor, sort of like the Princess Bride, when they put him in the wheelbarrow.
Yeah,
and so when it was time for Goliath to come into the sanctuary, they rolled him in the shopping cart from the back of the sanctuary, and I was just it was like a lot of synergy happened right there.
Oh, that's amazing. Oh, I could just picture it. That's awesome. So
I will say this, having gone from a program director to associate pastor to solo pastor, I've never been less able to do stuff like that than I am now. I didn't know that. Like the more, that's the beauty of sort of being auxiliary or secondary, is that you can be present on the ground.
Yeah.
In that way.
Sure.
So I miss that. miss that part of it.
So tell me, and for those who may not, have an idea, tell me why that is. Is that a typical thing in the Presbyterian Church and ministry in general? What do you say to that? What do you think?
I think it boils down to like the administrative responsibilities and worship planning responsibilities of being a solo or head of staff. That eats up the majority of your week.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
if your primary job is running programs for youth and children, then you have time to put on a full magic show in the fellowship hall, or teach a like guitar class in the projects. Like that's not something I have time to do anymore.
Yeah. And it becomes a difficult balance that way. Like you're saying, juggling your time, balancing it to be able to do those relational type activities versus some of the day-to-day operations and in ministry and church life.
Yeah. I don't think it's bad necessarily. It just is
it's just different, right? Yeah, absolutely. If you had to pick one thing right now, what would it be that you could do? Like teach guitar, put on a magic show?
I taught a filmmaking class. The filmmaking class was I just loved it so much. We made a movie. In 10 weeks, we would make a movie. Like we would conceive of it and cast it and film it with the kids in the class. And
oh my goodness,
it was fun. I miss that.
Did you have like any experience with filmmaking, or is just kind of an activity you were like, hey man, let's just do it,
Yeah, in that environment, it was very much like, are you willing to try this? Then great, you're hired.
Man, in hearing these stories, Tim, I just think, how much of ministry and relating with people is just kind of just putting yourself out there and just going, just doing it, and I see that example in your work.
Well, it was also the case.
Is that fair?
Yeah. And you needed, the core skill was like holding the room,
True. Yeah.
And so if you actually, we did hire some teachers who were like very technically skilled, but if you couldn't hold the room, then you really were going to have a hard time. But if you could hold the room, then honestly, you could teach almost anything.
Oh man,
I'm not saying that's true in life. It's just it was true in this after school program. And I do think it is, to some degree, it is true in ministry. Like being able to hold the room and love people and sort of create a space is like kind of the foundation of everything you do. And the programs are just window dressing. Or sometimes they are just they're a reason to be together,
Yeah. Oh, that's such a great point. Thank you for sharing that, Tim, with us. And I hope that that grows some legs and people can hear that and take that with them. So you were there in Boston with that church for a while, and then what happened after that? Where'd you go after that?
So basically I decided I didn't want to wait. I did not want to spend 3 years in the ordination process after the denomination changed its ordination standards to include LGBTQ people.
Sure.
So I entered the ordination process, and as far as I know, that was legal to do. It was legal to be in the ordination process. It just wasn't legal to be ordained, which is, wild. But
yeah.
From my point of view, and again, as a person who sort of was very new to the Presbyterian Church, my attitude was not, I was like, well, if this doesn't work out, I'll go do something else. This is not my life dream to be a Presbyterian minister. And nonetheless, though, as I'm doing this job, I'd like to go through the process. And so because I was basically done with the process when the standards changed, I was one of the very first people to formally go through. And then part of being ordained was becoming unaffordable to this little church,
Yeah. That's kind of the downside to that, right?
Yeah, they couldn't afford a second pastor. So I just decided to do a national search. And then I came to Baltimore to be the associate pastor at Brown Memorial, Park Avenue. Because I was excited about the congregation. I was excited to work with Andrew Connors, and I was particularly excited that the church was affiliated with Build, because I was
Oh,
really interested in community organizing, and
okay.
the congregation that I worked for in Boston was aligned with a sister organization in
I see.
Boston.
I see.
So that's why I came back to Baltimore.
Okay. Well, so I'm a little bit familiar with Build. Can you shed some light on what that organization does? For those who may not know, what's their main focus? And what do they do?
It's like 45 institutions in Baltimore City, most of whom are faith-based institutions, most of whom are Christian, but there are Jewish institutions, and also some schools and neighborhood associations and labor unions. But basically organizing within their own communities to learn what sort of social justice issues we want to collectively work on at the level of the city government. So,
Gotcha.
45 institutions that hit on all these different constituencies. There's no canned speech that a politician has to give to the Black church, the Catholic church, the Jewish synagogue, and the Unitarian Universalists.
Right.
It's like
Right.
when those people align around a single interest, it's actually very powerful.
Absolutely.
But it's also been just a whole lens through which to develop relational capital within the congregation. So it's got like an external missional purpose, but it's also been a very effective way of rebuilding a congregation, if that makes sense.
Yes, I think so. And it speaks to sort of the conversation around community and what it means to be community, your neighbors and those outside your windows, and those who you see as you walk to the grocery store and things like that, right? And the issues that people deal with, and the idea that collectively we can do a lot more than we can singular, which is amazing.
Yeah, and one of the most powerful insights is that the issues are really secondary to the relationships.
Yeah.
And that's where I think people get stuck.
Sure.
Because if the group is in the room because they care about an issue, then when the issue is resolved, the group disappears.
Yep.
That's
such a great point.
Building a network of people who are primarily about being in relationship with each other and then deciding what they want to do with it is much more powerful, because you can transcend whatever issue cycle there is. And not to say the issues aren't important, but like you can't build a community that's based around caring about after school programming. You really need to build a community that cares for each other, and because they care for each other, they care about after school programming.
That's right. Absolutely. And I think, Tim, that's a message that more of us need to hear, that it's not just about issues, because we can translate that into the church as well, right? Like, it's not about the programs, right? We could have and forgive my ribbing, but we can put on a magic show. That's great. But what's more important? It's the relationships, because as you demonstrated in that in your time there in that church in Boston, that it was about the relationships that kept the kids coming back or engaged, or made them feel cared about and cared for, right? So it's not just the programming.
There's a church planner named Emily Scott, who's a friend of mine here in Baltimore, and she was telling me that she, on principle, doesn't start her sermon until Friday morning, because if she started it earlier in the week, she would spend too much time on it.
Yeah.
And like, no one in seminary ever talked about spending too much time on your sermon.
No.
But she basically said, like, I have to, because she is starting a new worshiping community. And she basically said, it's more important for me to be out there meeting people, because what's the point in spending 2 days working on a sermon that ultimately no one will be there to hear?
Right. Yeah. And
I just was so trained that the sermon was like everything, and that the idea that you would intentionally limit yourself to 1 8-hour day, or less than that, because the sermon was actually not your number one priority, because you need people there to hear it, or else it doesn't matter. It just disappears, that's framing that I don't feel like I got in seminary.
I think you're right. I recently heard a podcast with a Presbyterian pastor out in California who started a new worshiping community with a community of folks who have different disabilities, mental disability and physical disability, and so on and so forth. And one of the things that she kind of touched on was kind of this idea that, how do you preach to someone who may not have the capacity to hear this, seminary trained, and this pastor's a PhD, has all the degrees, and she's amazing. But how do you preach to someone who doesn't have the mental capability to understand, these high level sermons that we get trained, many of us get trained that we need to be able to do. And so it just made me think, like, yeah, it kind of reiterates your point that is that really, the focus is, do we put maybe too much attention to that, rather than focusing on, there's a little bit of a cliche out there, I'm sure you're familiar with, but meeting people where they're at. There's a lot of truth in it, and unfortunately it's been kind of thrown around a little bit too much. But to be where people are, and if it's meeting someone who's not able to understand a sermon like that, is there a different way that we can preach to them? And it's an interesting thought, and I'm glad you bring that up to consider. Well, where are do we really need to focus so much attention on that, or is it more important about the relationships? And I tend to agree with you on that, and that's where my theology resides as well. So thank you for sharing that. That's awesome. So you were at Brown Memorial Park Avenue for a while as associate pastor. 4 years.
4 years.
4 years, and then you went on to Light Street.
Yeah, I was completely happy at Brown. Not really looking to leave, but I basically, Light Street sort of sent out a email, for lack of a better word. It was not a formal process, which is very typical of how things go here.
Gotcha.
And in fact, they were sort of they got very good advice from the presbytery. The presbytery was very helpful to this church, and I'm happy to say that on this podcast, because they thriving congregations and the COM were both giving them really great advice that they had about 3 to 5 more years in their current sort of way of being. Gotcha. And what did they want to do with this moment? Did they want to sort of ride that out through the 3 to 5 years, or did they want to think about trying to reinvent? And on their own, and with the guidance from the COM, the congregation really came to this clear consensus that they wanted to try, and they called it "Go big or go home." That was like the mantra. Yeah. And so, but they couldn't afford an installed pastor.
Sure.
So they basically were looking for someone who would serve as a temporary. Well, they wanted a designated pastor, but somebody who was kind of outside the financial guarantees of an installation, and that person would have 3 years at 3/4 time. Basically, that's what they knew they could commit to paying with the remainder of the money that the church had. So spending the money to zero, they could hire a 3/4 time pastor for 3 years. And there was something about the way in which they were going all in with all the chips that just felt really exciting to me.
Okay.
And I had the privilege of being in a dual income household where we felt like we could take that kind of risk at that time.
Sure.
And so I applied for it.
Wow. Well,
and I have to say, like, I was so lucky that Brown Memorial is a healthy church, and they saw this as an opportunity to sort of they saw it as mission, essentially, not in a paternal way, but like just they saw it as an opportunity to expand their relational impact, and they became incredibly supportive of what we were doing. And one of the reasons why things have gone well at Light Street is because Brown Memorial has kind of been there at every turn, cheering us on and letting me run copies there, letting me steal their Christmas pageant costumes. It's like incredible auxiliary
awesome.
resources over there. Yeah.
Well, and in some ways, you kind of embodied that mantra of go big or go home on your end too, right? Because there was a bit of a risk there. I mean, and it's all faith, leap of faith, right? That's what it all is. So you got
and
to
that
do
sense
that as
of
well.
urgency and is like what's lacking, I feel like, in a lot of congregations,
Sure.
because they have enough money to not take risks, but not enough money to survive. And that's like a really deadly place to be.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So this church had a very clear, the way they said it is that they missed the nudge and they missed the shove. And now there was like this plank that hit them over the top of the head and said, you are about to close.
Wow. That's a big message right there. Say that again. Yeah. They missed the nudge. They missed the bump.
Or they missed, I can't remember.
Something like that. Yeah.
On the search committee. They were just like, okay, we woke up and we were like, this is kind of it.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. And I wonder if many more of our churches have had those little nudges and bumps, and then kind of I miss those things too, or any of us really, and that's a great image illustration there.
And I just think it's so important to name the fact that was in the DNA of this community. Yeah. Well before I got here. They were very faithfully led by a half-time pastor for 12 years who did great ministry with them, but always had another church.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah.
And so it's always been a congregation of like really creative, resilient people. And they just arrived at a moment of clarity. And that was exciting.
Absolutely. So Tim, do you think it was that creativity, that embodiment is that unique to Light Street and that community that surrounds them, or are there more churches like that? Are we all like that?
I'm sure there are more churches like that. I'm sure there are, but I also do think it's rare.
Gotcha.
And I think institutionally and structurally, sometimes our churches are not well equipped to be nimble and take risks, because like the system itself is designed fairly conservatively.
Right. And in terms of kind of taking a broader look at that, what do you can you speak to the institution kind of dynamic of it? What do you mean by that for those that might not understand what you're referring to?
I guess, I mean, I'm talking off the top of my head. So
sure.
That makes me nervous.
Yeah.
But like these are our churches are designed to sort of survive as like multi-generational institutions that are self-sustaining, and when they cease to be self-sustaining, I don't know that there's like an obvious toolkit for what to do then.
Yeah. And that's a tough place to be in.
You can't afford your program staff anymore, or you can't afford a custodian.
Right.
When I got here, all of the paper supplies were, including the toilet paper and the paper towels, were being brought by members on Sunday morning. So like people would notice there was no more toilet paper, and they would just come with more toilet paper the next Sunday.
Wow.
Like that was how this church was functioning. The yard was cut by the same volunteer for 15 years.
Oh my goodness.
And so they were just already quite off the grid. Gotcha. And that was crazy making, but also just like rich with opportunity, because there was no illusion that there was an institution here that needed to sort of, like, sometimes I feel like there are opportunities that get sacrificed at the altar of like maintaining the current institution. Right. And that was not the case here, because the institution itself was already pretty skeletal. But then with a really, really interesting group of people still here. And I was also very lucky that there was a thriving community, a dense and thriving community all around. So that was another reason why we had
in some reason, in some ways, I mean to say that, when you get down to that skeletal sort of framework, as you were saying, it allows people to step up and share their gifts, and maybe even
Yes,
see, gifts and strengths in people that we might not have seen otherwise. Is that fair to say?
that's
Do you think?
totally true. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
because there's no one, like if there's no toilet paper, that creates a sense of urgency.
yeah. That's right. That's right.
And that sense of urgency can like activates people, and then
I
they feel like truly needed, and that can tip into a toxic place. But like,
sure.
I do know that people come here like 3 or 4 times, and then they start contributing because they get a sense of like, oh man, no one's going to do that if I don't do that.
Yeah. Oh man. And that gives people the opportunity to step up and participate in maybe ways, maybe in ways previously, if because we all kind of get in this mindset, and I do this at home, oh, I don't need to do this. Someone else will take care of it, or
Yeah,
and when you get into that mindset of no, 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 I try to teach my kids this too, like, hey, if you walk by a piece of trash on the floor, a piece of paper, don't just walk by it, recognize it, then pick it up. And if it's trash, throw it away. If it needs to be, put away, then put it away, and it gives them an
yeah.
opportunity to step up as well.
The shadow
So
side of it is like when you I don't want to create an institution that relies upon volunteer labor for its survival,
sure,
because then
sure.
it can become manipulative.
Yeah,
So I feel like we're always trying to go back to the questions of like, what do we, the community, want to do together? And how are we going to do that? And if nobody wants to do this thing anymore, then let's kill it.
then
Because
don't
like,
do it. Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. And so basically it's a balance between sort of that volunteer expectation, really, I guess I would say the word is more appropriately is engagement, right? Like how people want to be engaged and what are they willing to support, both financially and with their own non-financial gifts, right?
yeah, buy-in. Like, what are you bought
Buy
in? And
in. I like that.
if you're not, then like that's where we should be working, not on like how are we going to staff this program that nobody wants to come to.
That's right.
But it's
That's right.
really hard. It's so much easier to say that than it is to do it, because
Oh
you know
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I've experienced some of that myself.
yeah,
It's really tough. So you've been there with Light Street for about 4 years, a little over 4 years, you were telling me.
yeah.
And what have been some fun moments that you all have shared together, that folks in the presbytery might not know about, and what kinds of things do you all do for to in celebration?
The first thing came to mind is that I don't know if people realize this, but it's very difficult to get here on Ravens home game
Oh,
weekends. Like,
oh no.
it has nothing to do with are you a football fan? It's literally just very difficult to drive and park here.
Traffic. Oh my gosh.
Um, and so when I arrived, the church just sort of like had resolved to have very, very small worship services on home game weekends, because most people just didn't want to deal with it. And sometimes they would get here and spend 45 minutes looking for a parking spot and then have to go home and never
Oh
made it
my.
into the building.
Oh my goodness.
And that just felt like a huge problem, because every fall you'd want to like sort of get your momentum going, and then you'd hit these 8 Sundays
Yeah.
where people couldn't get to the building.
Oh
Um,
my goodness. And
and
I
so
imagine
one
it
of
didn't matter what time the game started either, right? Like people were
I mean,
just
four
hanging
is
out.
better than one. Four is better than one, but the tailgating would start early, and
Yeah.
also people could, like people were selling their parking spots for $30.
Oh my
So,
goodness.
there's good economic incentive for there not to be any parking available on Sunday morning here.
Oh, sure, sure.
Um, so basically, the church just had kind of given up on having church on those weekends, which I understand. So we started having a conversation about whether or not it was possible to have church on Saturdays on Ravens weekends,
Okay.
and just go ahead and give up on Sunday morning church and concede that it was too hard to get here. And like, what would happen if we did Saturday church on Ravens home game weekends? And then I put together, there was a team of elders from Brown Memorial and Light Street that were working on that together, because
Oh,
Brown wanted to
good.
know how they could help us, but then they couldn't really help us on Sunday mornings, because everybody
Sure.
was already involved. But
Sure.
when we started scheduling these 8 Saturday services, then Brown committed to sending 12 people to each one of those services.
Oh my goodness.
And at this time, we were averaging about 25 people in worship. So the idea of having an extra 12 was huge.
Absolutely.
And those services were so fun. And I found out that you could really experiment in a Saturday service, Saturday at 4. So Saturday afternoon. And people loved the idea that they had done church already, and then they could just like chill on Sunday. But also
Sure.
we tried a bunch of stuff on Saturdays that I think would have freaked people out on Sundays, but because it was Saturday and because the light was different, everything just felt different.
Oh, yeah,
Um,
sure.
and so we don't do it anymore, because now that we are hybrid,
Oh,
honestly,
sure.
that sort of solved the people who are highly motivated to get to the building, come to the building, and otherwise we just know that a majority of our people are going to be online on those weekends.
Sure.
But we did keep a lot of the eventide. We called it eventide because of the word that like sort of that space between dusk and dark is called eventide.
Yeah.
And so we've kept a lot of the eventide practices. We just integrated them into Sunday morning.
Oh, that's
which is cool, because at the end of the day, we learned that people basically like coming to church on Sunday. We thought it was super cool that we were doing it on Saturday afternoons, and we were going to get all these people who didn't want to get up in the morning. And people did come to the service, but after 2 years, they were like, let's just do it on Sunday.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting.
I know, it is interesting. So we went back to Sunday, and but we kept a lot of the stuff that we tried.
Oh, good. Oh, that's awesome. And in some ways, I think how awesome that you were given that freedom to try something new and
Yeah.
see what worked. And then you were able to sort of best practices, the intention of keeping what works best and what would be helpful and meaningful.
It did. I think this is the thing, is that when you say out loud, what if we stopped having church on Sundays? And people are like, wait a minute, you can do that? It took like an intractable problem, which was 8 Sundays every fall. We basically lose more than half of our worship attendance.
Right.
Even if the Saturdays didn't work, which ultimately, they did work, but it kind of also didn't work. Just invoking it as an option was very energizing, because people were like, what are you doing?
And it provided you the opportunity to see what was meaningful to people. I was on a Zoom conference call the other day, where a church member of a different church in down in Texas, who talked about their pandemic experience of some people not going to, leaving the church, and them going digital or virtual, and so forth. The way he characterized it was like fire going through the church. And I hadn't heard it quite this way before, but a fire going through the church to give the opportunity to take away the things that weren't important. And in some cases, the people that were kind of going through the motions, that didn't want to be there, they stopped coming. And so I just thought, man, what an incredible image, and an opportunity to kind of, the overall idea being that, what are the things that we hold as sacred that really aren't sacred. And that's an important process that churches could and should go through, to figure out, hey, do we really need to focus on this, when it's not really that meaningful to us, and so I just thought that was an interesting, image. And it sounds like in some way that you got the opportunity to figure out what's more important or most important to you all and to in your worship context.
I think that's true. I also don't want to diminish how hard it is right now. I mean, like,
Yeah.
it's very hard right now. I find this part of the pandemic to be the hardest part.
Tell me more about that.
Well, it's just, when we all went virtual, it was like it was more clear, and there was a lot of novelty in that moment, and people were proud of the fact that we were pulling it off. And there was also an intimacy in a fully virtual space, because you could see everyone's faces and you were catching glimpses of their houses, and like,
that's right.
I was like I was leading worship from right here for a long time. And then I went back into the sanctuary, and then as other people started going back into the sanctuary, it felt more and more fractured,
Gotcha.
between the people who were online and the people who are in the room. And then people just have not been coming back as much as we would hope. And I'm hearing that from everyone.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think what you just said is totally true. And also, we're still very much in the like forest fire devastation portion of the cycle.
Right.
Like I like to think that good things are going to grow out of this.
Absolutely.
But it just sucks right now.
It does. And thank you for coming back around, because what I failed to mention was the other half of this church member's, statement was that, in that fire or post that fire, there's this, there's resurrection, and we believe as resurrection people, there's new life and new birth and new things that come out of that. So thank you for pointing that out, and forgive me for failing to point that out. But that's so true, right? We're in the thick of it right now, right? And maybe in some ways we thought that we were getting over it a little bit before the Delta surge. We were kind of thinking that we were seeing the end of the light at the end of the tunnel, and yet we've still been kind of thrown back into it, and so we're still in the fire, but there's hope that there'll be new growth and new opportunity and new life once we get through this. And so thank you for sharing that.
I don't want to belabor your metaphor, but I think there's the fire, and then there's like this dead space after the fire. And that's where I feel like we are right now.
The dead space, yeah.
The fire
kind
had
of
its own life.
Simmering, smoldering ashes kind of thing,
Or just dead, just cold, dead, empty. You know what I mean? Like, and that's what I was not prepared for. I think the fire was like, it's a fire, and everybody activates.
That's a good point. Yeah.
And what I feel now is just like this empty space.
Yeah.
And people are not rushing back into it. And that's why this part has felt so exhausting. And I do think that the good stuff is coming, but I am naming like the emptiness of this current season, because it is, and especially because it's fall, so it's supposed to be
that's true.
Very full.
Yeah.
And that makes it even harder to sit with the lack of activity that is just because people are not ready, and because we're going to have to rebuild it.
Yeah. And I think you said something similar earlier, in that just naming it gives people the freedom to live into it, to recognize that it's okay. It's okay. Yeah. We're in this dead space. I like how you phrase that, because that gives a different image to me, and that's helpful. And hopefully that's helpful to others as well. But yeah, being in this dead space, and what do we do with that?
Yeah.
No, I appreciate you sharing that. So what overall, how would you characterize Light Street's dealing with the pandemic? How's it been? Has it been really, grinding? I mean, you shared a little bit, but is there more to it? What's your sense of the time during the pandemic?
Well, there are ways in which we've been very lucky. We pivoted to online, I think, pretty well. We did get bigger during the pandemic, which is was very unexpected, because we did start seeing people from outside of Baltimore, which again was like nothing we were ever even planning to do. It's just that because we were accessible,
sure,
we did a live Zoom service So it was like we could see people when they showed up, and
Yeah,
it was a lot
cool.
of friends and family for the most part. Um,
Sure.
but so that all felt really great, and it took me a while to understand that I was getting really hollowed out, because in spite of the fact that we were numerically doing fine, not being together in person was really killing me. And
Sure.
not everyone, I've learned not everyone was having that problem.
Yeah. Right,
some people
right.
some people like really love this new way of being, and but for me, I was just finding myself kind of like just good, like for me it was a lot of pumping out of content, and
Right.
then just sort of trusting that it was finding a home out there.
Absolutely.
And sometimes in-person worship feels that way too, but there's always a fullness to the people in the room that I really missed. So, and then now that we're not even in that full rich virtual space, we're now in this like struggling
Yeah,
hybrid thing.
hybrid.
um
Yeah.
and it is starting to come back to life in the room, and we're trying really hard to maintain the vitality of the virtual space as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's the paradox for me, is that we were lucky and fortunate, we were blessed in a lot of ways. But I'm in touch with the ways in which I am like kind of desperate for physical in-person worship again.
Absolutely. And it speaks to our human nature of wanting connection and touch, even with people, or just being around people and community in that sense.
Yeah,
um and that's not to say, because I think you pointed it out too, that there are some people that have thrived in a virtual capacity, in a virtual setting,
yeah,
for different reasons, and
yeah,
that's good to know too. And I wonder if that kind of, God willing, post all of this, if we can, naming or recognizing that there are folks that have that trait, that feel more comfortable in a virtual setting, for different reasons. Of course, some are medical reasons, some
hmm
are social reasons, and so on. But if we can remember them as we plan and lead moving forward, I think that would be helpful, to be kind of more inclusive and bring people in. So that might be something worthwhile as we
but we did
move
have
forward.
we had three people join the church from out of state, which was so
Whoa!
cool.
Yeah.
um and I know that this is the Presbytery podcast, so I don't know that I'm getting in trouble with any quality police. But we did have three out of state people join the church, and one of them is going to serve on our nominating committee,
Oh my
because we're
goodness!
like really trying to make it clear that our virtual people are completely involved, to the extent that we can make it happen.
Absolutely.
Um, and in fact, we're going to try to create some roles for virtual people, because as some of our more and more of our key leaders are kind of gravitating back to the sanctuary, there's a lack of leadership in the virtual space, you know and so
Wow.
we might need a virtual deacon, for example, and like to actually ordain a person to a virtual deacon role would be really cool, and I think we're going to try to do that in
Yeah.
2022.
Oh, that's amazing. And that's pioneering. That's trailblazing work.
Yeah,
If you ask me, in my humble opinion, that's amazing. How
and it's
cool!
it's a role that like increasingly local people can't do, because if you're
Right.
going to be in the room, you really can't pay attention to what's happening in the chat, or like the context clues that you might get from the Zoom. And so the people who are we need people playing those roles non-locally, and it's awesome because we would like to find roles for those non-local people to play.
Absolutely. Oh, I think that's amazing, Tim, that y'all are thinking so progressively, creatively, right? To engage people. And this is the idea, we talked about this earlier, engaging people, meeting people where they're at.
Yeah,
If we take that at face value, it's actually a meaningful statement to engage with people where they feel that they are. That's incredible. Man, well, blessings to you on that project to Light Street as you discern and I've no doubt prayerfully discern and we look forward to hearing more about that and your progress. Tim, I want to respect your time, and so we're kind of drawing to a natural close here. I wonder if there's anything else that you wanted to share or talk about. I would like to extend the invitation, my friend. I've enjoyed our time together, but I hope that maybe, if there's something else we can do this again as well, and maybe we can talk more about new things that are happening at Light Street or new things that are happening with you. Is there anything else that you want to talk about here at the
Yes,
conclusion?
I just want to go on the record. I want to go on the
Yes.
record. I'm ready for hybrid presbytery gatherings.
Ooh,
It's
tell me
time.
more about that. Tell me more about that.
Well, let's just do a hybrid gathering where people can come to a physical space if they feel comfortable, or they can join virtually if they would rather. Because for one thing, for our Western Maryland people, what a solution that will be in the future. But also, I just think so many of us are doing it in our churches. It would be really wonderful to see our colleagues in person at Presbytery. And I know that it was about to happen this fall.
Right.
But I just want to go on the record and say I'm looking forward to having a little styrofoam cup and some sort of baked good that's wrapped in cellophane. If it's not too much to ask.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm glad that you shared that with us, and I hope that the powers that be tune into our podcast and watch this later on. And
the gathering team has done an amazing job. I mean, they have done really incredible work. This is in no way a criticism. I'm just stating my excitement for the prospect of something that's in person or hybrid in the future.
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally heard it that way. So I hope that others received it as well, man. Because you and I met last week or so, the other week, for outdoors in coffee. We grabbed some coffee together, and it was so cool. So great to see you again. I hadn't seen you in person in a while, and so
for sure,
that sense of community relationship between pastors and elders and church folks, and we're slowly but surely getting that way, and we're recording this podcast just after the announcement this week that the children ages 5 to 11 are going to be able to get their vaccinations soon. So hopefully that's another big step forward into all of us being able to be hybrid and connect with one another. So my friend, thank you again for your time. I enjoyed our conversation. As I said, I hope that we can do this again. You and I had talked about maybe talking about some scripture and some different ideas, theology. Maybe we can talk theology a little bit. So maybe next time we can do something like that. And so I extend the invitation to you, and I hope that maybe one day we can do this again. How does that sound to you?
Sounds good. Thanks, Jose.
Awesome. Well, friends, thank you so much for tuning in and joining us. I want to say thank you to Tim Hughes-Williams, Pastor Tim Hughes-Williams, for your time, for sharing your heart with us and spending time with us today. And I enjoyed it. I hope everyone enjoys our podcast today, and we look forward to the next one. All right. Thank you all. Take care. Bye-bye. Boom. And see, it's a bit ridiculous, but I'm going to